is I was assigned a topic when I was asked to speak this year. And the topic was, is there a retirement crisis? Now, I was with a group a week ago, and the topic they'd assigned me was, are defined benefit plans really better than defined contribution plans? And one of the individuals in the room who felt that the answer was definitively and always for all people at all times yes, criticized me for even agreeing to speak to the topic. And so please don't get mad at me for speaking to the topic of, is there a retirement crisis? I did. Some of you know Nevin Adams, who for many years has been in this business, going back nearly 30 years when he was in the banking business at Northern Trust doing defined contribution, and then at Wachovia. And Nevin made a comment to me when I was assigned the topic, and I said, well, you know, this is potentially a controversial answer. And he said, well, have you gone to the dictionary to find out what is the definition of a crisis? So I answered to him, well, no, I haven't. So I'd like a show of hands. How many of you have ever looked in the dictionary to see what the definition of crisis is? That's a relief to me. For at least two reasons. It's a relief for one reason, which is that this will be new information to you, as it was new information to me. Because I went at the project of preparing this presentation against that question of let's step back, let's view this as what should be a question to which we apply data and facts. That we would meet the objectives of Ray Lillywhite, that we'd apply to the broader retirement income area the kinds of facts that Mohammed and others applied yesterday to other issues. And if one goes to that question, the wrong button. The first piece of that definition is a crucial or decisive point or situation, a turning point, if you will. The second, an unstable condition, as in political, social, or economic affairs involving an impending, abrupt, or decisive change. So against those two criteria, everyone in this room would be able to agree, now that they've seen the two first components of the definition, that yesterday's repeated reference to the financial crisis that we've just celebrated the 5th anniversary of was in fact a crisis. It came out of nowhere. It required or involved impending and abrupt change, and a sudden change. And a sudden change in direction is the third component of the definition toward either improvement or deterioration. Now, the only piece of this that I think maybe a little bit in the retirement space, we actually could say, well, maybe something applies, is that as the data will show, we may well actually, with the morphing of the system, have against the third piece moved in a direction of improvement. Against the objective that Larry Zimpelman just noted, or something that I'll mention as an amendment for the timeline in P&I when they do their 45th anniversary or 50th anniversary timeline. So I do a call out to one of yesterday's speakers, Tom Woodruff. And Tom and I met in the 1970s. He was at the Labor Department. I was at the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. We both ended up interviewing for the same job. The job was to become executive director of the newly appointed Presidential Commission on Retirement Policy and Pension Policy that was appointed by President Carter, which was missing from your timeline, and I would suggest was rather significant to the developments of the last 30 years, 35, 40. And that commission, under Tom's staff leadership and under the leadership of its chairman, Peter McCullough, then the chairman and CEO of Xerox Corporation, recommended something that today gets written about in the press and written about by some academics in editorial pieces as if it's a new idea. And the Carter Commission, which immediately became termed the Carter Commission upon the election of Ronald Reagan, the Carter Commission recommended a mandatory system of defined benefit and/or defined contribution plans to be provided by employers so that individuals would have an opportunity to participate in one type of plan or another with the ability for an offset. That led to a next change, which was not on the timeline, so it's my second amendment. It was the 1984 action by the United States Congress to be the first enterprise, the first large employer in the United States to move from a very rich defined benefit plan with no defined contribution and no Social Security to a 1.1% defined benefit plan to a automatic 1% contribution 401k style plan with matching that would get you to 6% and the addition of Social Security. So the first employer in the United States of size to respond to some of what was in the President's Commission report was in fact the federal government, to move to a diverse system, and what was one of the primary reasons given? Because even in the federal government, which was one of the most stable employers with the most full career workers of any employer in the nation, only about 20% of those that came to work for the federal government ever worked long enough to have an adequate retirement income based even on a 2.4% per year formula defined benefit plan. Why? Because they didn't stay long enough. And if they didn't stay long enough in the federal government to get an adequate benefit to over 90% of the people, in fact, from defined benefit, then essentially, since no private entity had that type of system, you couldn't do it there. So against those definitions, is there a retirement crisis in America? No. None of the criteria are met. Underline none. Is there a Social Security crisis based on those criteria and definitions? No. Is there a Medicare crisis? Yes, it qualifies. Why? Because today you'd have to triple payroll taxes or reduce by 60% Medicare benefits immediately going forward, one or the other, to have Medicare be financially sustainable. So Medicare's a challenge. I view it as a crisis. Some public pension funds, some public defined benefit pension plans, somebody might pick on the state of Illinois. I would never do that. The president's from there. But some might pick on Illinois or some of the states. But there are other states that are in fine shape. Some private single employer and multi-employer plans clearly are in crisis mode. Tom's early years were with the mine workers before he went into the government. The mine workers' pension funds, which were redefined by ERISA in 1974, are back on a precipice. And there are some multi-employer plans in other industries that face the same type of crisis as to whether or not they will be able to survive in the absence of legislative or other action. And there are clearly some individuals and families always in a retirement crisis or other crisis because of life circumstances. For many, take from yesterday's presentation, the statistics on the hardcore unemployed. the notation that if individuals between 20 and 25 don't end up getting themselves into a job process, they could become hardcore unemployed and never able to pull themselves out. So there are clearly issues. One of them is technical in terms of the slides. And that was a way of telling me you're talking too much. If my wife was here, who Tom had the pleasure of working with decades ago, she would say, you always do that. So if one looks at this against that historical footnote, and one asks the question of, are we better or worse off than we were yesterday? I found this note from the Social Security website, a telling one. You can quickly read through it, I won't, but the bottom line is, things have gotten progressively better, decade upon decade, year upon year. The data for 2013 came out. We just finished tabulating it. It got better in 2013. If one then looks and says, well, how much have things changed? Well, ironically, they have not changed a great deal. This start data point when the government started collecting this information was 62, 63. Outside the history of the 40-year anniversary of P&I, a great occasion that I'm pleased to be here to help celebrate. And it was the Kennedy Commission on Retirement Policy, whose report essentially contained much of what ended up being in ERISA in 1974. And one of the things that was initiated tied to the Kennedy Commission was the beginning of the collection of various data series by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Census Bureau to provide information to that commission so that it could evaluate the U.S. retirement system based on the numbers. And what do these numbers show us? If we take the top bar, Social Security is and was the most common source of income. If we go to the green line, earnings was a major source, or excuse me, asset income is on the green line. Earnings, which is the red line, earnings have been a consistent important thing. This was 62 to 10, and the pension piece of this is the purple line. And in the good old days and the bad old days, the percentage receiving income from pensions, it dipped down after the early 60s, which was the initial retirement boom from the initial defined benefit plans that under the law really couldn't be enacted today or put in place. Why? Because they had no funding requirements and they could give immediate 30-year pass credit in order to retire people in the early 50s in order to open up jobs for the kids coming back from the war, which turned into the Studebaker bankruptcy and the loss of pension benefits at Studebaker because of that burden, and even in a growing economy, not enough income for that company to maintain that promise. And Studebaker, as many of you know, if you go back to your history or watch old TV specials, Studebaker was the picture postcard example that led to ERISA. And what about shares of aggregate income? Social Security, fairly constant since 1962, the top line, down a little bit in shares. The purple line is earnings. What happened with earnings? We dropped down into about a low point of 13% participation in the labor force of those over the age of 65. What caused that? Well, the enactment of Medicare and Medicaid in the 1960s. The availability of health insurance, which up until those programs were there, no employer or union offered in any real form to large numbers of people. And what do we know about health insurance? At the workplace, we know that if you ask employees, as we do in our value of benefits survey, if you can only have one benefit, what would it be? 80+% say health insurance. If you then say, if you can have a second benefit, what would it be? 35% say more health insurance. When we first asked those questions 25 years ago, the second most common response, which was still down in the 30 percentiles, was a pension plan. And a savings plan was way down from that. This year, when we asked that question, a pension plan was down at 12%, and a savings plan was up closer to 40%. And what have we seen as well during this period? As individuals have realized more readily, and as employers post other changes, mainly accounting changes, not legislative changes, our friends at the Financial Accounting Standards Board and the Government Accounting Standards Board put in accounting for liabilities for retiree medical. And as governments are now for the first time having to say this is the liability, when General Motors had to do that accounting, it was an immediate balance sheet liability of nearly $20 billion. And immediately a priority of General Motors was, how do we stop providing retiree medical benefits to at least future hires, if not others that are not yet retired? And that happened across the private sector. So no action can be expected to not get a reaction, whether it's private regulation or public regulation. And so people have gone back to work. They're working longer. And it is largely to pay for health insurance, just like in the current designs. We heard yesterday people moving to high deductible plans. Health insurance is annually, year in and year out, increasing more compensation. And in our surveys, in the Health Confidence Survey, now 14 years, for 14 years, of the 50% that say last year my health cost at work went up, another 50% said they helped pay for that by reducing what they were saving for retirement. The theory of total compensation and total rewards is real. It's real for everyone in this room and every employee that we touch, through our own workplaces or through those that we work with. And pension income, as you can see, again, the red line, has remained amazingly constant since 1968. So supportive of the notion that there's been a dramatic change in the makeup of what is there doesn't fit. Has there been a big change in what employers are spending? Stress employers on behalf of their workers. And as you see, there's been a slow increase, but there hasn't been a dramatic or fundamental change. There's been a remixing of what's going into defined benefit and defined contribution plans, but this is a combination of public and private sector employers. And were you to break this data, which I didn't for a slide, but if you break this data, what you end up finding is over that whole period, the private sector proportion of compensation going to defined benefit plans by private employers with defined benefit plans has been a lower percentage than goes to defined contribution plans for the last 40 years, which is the period during which the data has been measured. And if one then looks at what has happened to income sources, this shows your earnings is up a bit. Income from assets is down a bit, which, as best as we can tell from the data, is because individuals are saving more through qualified plans and IRAs, which at one point was not in that environment, so it was income from assets. Social Security, about the same. Pensions up dramatically since the year that ERISA was enacted. And the pension data here is defined benefit, defined contribution, IRA. It's any program within the tax qualified nexus of any design type. And as most in this room know, take a look. Larry mentioned he and I had worked together at the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation decades ago. Today, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, of the active participants in defined benefit plans on whom premiums are being paid to the PBGC, 44% of them are in cash balance defined benefit plans that offer single sum distribution options. Another 22% are from defined benefit plans of a traditional design that offer single sum options. And our most recent publication on this, which looked at detailed data on DB plans by specific plan design in those private defined benefit plans where there is an open, unrestricted choice between taking an annuity or taking a single sum distribution, 27% take an annuity, the balance take a single sum distribution. So the types of challenges that Larry Zimpelman mentioned in terms of helping our participants at whatever age figure out what to do and when is a phenomena of defined benefit plans as well as defined contribution plans across the history and quotes of the 35 years of the existence of the Employee Benefit Research Institute. It is not a sudden thing, and it is not a plan type debate any longer. It's an end result debate. In the public sector, most public sector defined benefit plans still fit that traditional model, an annuity only, and a defined benefit. But we're seeing in states like Michigan and Alaska and others a beginning of movement in that area, which will largely probably be dictated by how well they protect that tail risk and how they work their way through things like the Illinois crisis. So where have we been in that post-74 period? Where have we been in essentially the 40 years of pension and investments? Is we've been in a world where the number of pension plans grew dramatically for the first 10 years of ERISA and then began leveling out. We've been in a world in which the shift has been in plan type and where active participants are. And we've been in a world where whatever the plan type is, benefit delivery has dramatically increased, and because of tighter vesting standards, and I underline, my father ended up with a defined benefit because he did spend 30 years with one employer, and up until the plan was amended for ERISA, the vesting standard was 25-year cliff vesting. So the vesting standard changed before he retired, but my sister-in-law, a nurse for 37 years, covered all 37 years by a defined benefit pension plan, was convinced that it was going to give her a good benefit. Got mad at her brother-in-law when I had the gall to say, well, how, do you know what your benefit's going to be? We heard yesterday one of the Innovator Awards was the Federal Thrift Plan, the TSP, and putting an annuity value on a defined contribution statement. Well, many defined benefit participants don't get statements that give them an annuity value that, wait a minute, maybe they do, but do they read it? Do they open it? Do they absorb it? So for all I know, my sister-in-law, love her as I do, may have gotten many statements that answered the question. I do not know. But she did not know the answer. And when she went and found out, she found out that that defined benefit plan, a hospital plan, the hospital industry has pretty lousy pension plans. We know that from the data. An annual accrual rate of less than 0.4% per year. So even though she made twice as much money at retirement as my brother, she got a pension that was a fraction of his pension because he worked for the state of Washington, plus he had 14 years of military credit, and it was a pension that had a 2% per year accrual. And suddenly she became an advocate of, yeah, maybe I should have him take that joint and survivor option. 15 of the 16 people in my brother's retirement class did not take the J&S option. I didn't know any of them except my brother, but I know my brother took it at 62 and my brother passed away at 64. And that's not a defined benefit story, it's an annuity story. It's a life income story. It's a choices can be bad or good in any type of retirement plan. And as much as I personally love and respect defined benefit annuities because it made the big difference for my family, that's a realm where education and helping participants make decisions is every bit as crucial as in the defined contribution space. And as you see from that green line of vesting, if anything, we have moved out of what might well have been a retirement crisis as the vesting rates have gone up to come close to matching the participation rates, so that the system that we have in place today, a mixed system, is delivering. The asset flows, the contributions, dramatically up. Why? Because contribution rates to defined contribution plans are generally significantly higher than contribution rates to defined benefit plans as a percentage of compensation. And everybody gets it, generally, because vesting periods are generally shorter, even in today's legislative environment, than they are in defined benefit plans. What is one of the ways that some public defined benefit plans have helped solve their current funding issues? They've gone back to 10-year cliff vesting. What percentage of the American labor force has median job tenure of 10 years or less? 72%. Over the age of 25. 55 to 64. Public sector workers, 60% do exceed 10 years median job tenure. Private sector, 55 to 64, neither men nor women break 10 years of median tenure. Plan benefits from the system coming out and growing dramatically during this period. Again, not the stuff of definitional crisis. So a crisis, no, as Larry and others have made clear during this meeting, shortfalls, absolutely. More to be done, as Larry articulated and our panels yesterday articulated so well. Far more to be done. Tremendous opportunities to continue improving the system. But necessities of improving all of the system, be it defined benefit, be it defined contribution, be it hybrid, with a focus on outcomes. Because I knew my brother smoked 3.5 packs a day. I learned on the news just yesterday that before he had his first heart attack, Dick Cheney was smoking 4 packs a day. And this was in his words on a video screen. And I know that my brother and a bunch of those guys he retired with, they spent a lot of time smoking together. So I don't know how many of those other people, the 15 that didn't take a joint and survivor option, it was all men, it was all spouses, females that didn't want them to take it. I don't know how many of them are still alive 7 years later. But one can have bad outcomes from any system, and the focus and the definition and the statements, including in articles of every publication anyone in this room reads, that implies that the old system was somehow nirvana and that we somehow now have a crisis relative to that, is not supported by the numbers, the facts, or the projections. In fact, things continue to get better. We have the most comprehensive databases of defined contribution and individual retirement accounts of anyone in the United States of America, or for that matter, the world. We do, in fact, have the most sophisticated retirement modeling of any entity in the United States vis-a-vis the data that we feed into it. with micro-level data from DB and DC programs, plus Social Security, plus, I say more comprehensive, because unlike many of those that you read about in the media that just give you a number, we factor in potential retiree medical major crises, and we factor in the probabilities of long-term care. And you heard the word yesterday and the 10,000 simulations and all of the things that macro modelers do. And we do that and we apply probabilities. So we don't give you one number for what you need for retiree medical, that one magic point estimate that everybody wants, or one replacement rate. And as you see, when we started this project in 2003, you can see the percentage that we're not on a course to be able to cover basic expenses in retirement, plus those major crises. And you see the bottom number, which is the percentage now at risk. Things are, in fact, statistically and quantitatively getting better because the system that we now have in place, because of what employers and others are doing to educate, to incent, to build contributions. And the American labor force does not, regrettably, have the average income of the employee at Intel, $148,000 a year. Or as we heard yesterday from Sonia, the average income of the Microsoft employee, $100,000 a year. It's way, way, way down from that, as is income in retirement. My grandmother, who was widowed at the age of 63, her Social Security benefit when she died at 87 was $6,000 per year. Over 40% of elderly widows today live on total household income of less than $6,500 per year. And if one looks at basic expenses as measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, making up the shortfalls, as this chart shows you, to get to 100% income replacement, which is the reason that I hate rules of thumb. I hate it when I read anything that says your target should be 85% replacement. Hey, like most things in life, it depends. I heard a number at a session yesterday. If you have an 8-time multiple of final income, you'll be fine. Our modeling and publications on far more complex assessments, looking at the full gamut of individuals, finds that for the lowest income Americans, it would actually require a multiple of 50. And for the highest income Americans, a multiple of 12. And then within the schematic of the highest income, we do about 20 boxes, because depending on what you have and what you don't have at work and what kinds of programs, even within the highest income, those multiples can change dramatically. And even at the 75th percentile, $210,000 is in fact enough to get that individual on top of Social Security to purchase an annuity at today's lousy annuity rates because of the Federal Reserve, without question. So the Fed does affect what all of us do every single day, but it also affects the choices that make sense or don't make sense right now for all of our participants. So replacement rates never really told the full story. They don't tell the full story. They shouldn't be used to tell the full story, even think they tell it, because they generally exclude much of medical expense, and as employers redesign programs, those old measures become even less relevant as one moves to a high deductible world. Long-term care is something that some of the modelers, one that comes out of Massachusetts, it solves the long-term care problem by assuming that every single person buys a long-term care policy at the age of 65. How many think there's the capacity in the long-term care market today to make that happen? As AARP no longer even sponsors a product because there wasn't enough capacity. or demand at the price levels, and other expenses that can be real. So one can get to the result we find in our retirement confidence survey: 24 consistent years, 54%, 49 to 54% of those that retire say the reason they retired was because of medical or disability-related issues. 26% because my job went away. The private sector or public sector changed. There was a financial crisis that my public sector job was no longer that lifetime security. And so if you think about all those numbers compared to those other shortfalls, the numbers actually change quite dramatically. Where what you actually ask is not replacement rate. I don't need 100% replacement rate. Most of those people making an average of $148,000 a year don't need 100% replacement rate. Most of those people making the average American household income of between $34,000 and $39,000, they need more than 100% replacement in many cases, particularly if they have special health issues. And so when we run those numbers and we think about medical and we think about long-term care, the shortfalls, particularly for the lower income end of the population, are significant relative to what they can accumulate. And what does it really tell us vis-a-vis the kind of leadership that Mohammed opened yesterday with and that Larry added today? It underlines, as do all the other data points I've shown you, the absolutely critical nature to this nation, as it was to my grandmother and my grandparents and my parents, the absolute critical component of Social Security. That if Social Security at that 12% plus tax rate is not sustained, then we will have a crisis, and it will not be a delayed one. And at 12+%, we could pay 78% of current benefits forever. Actually, if you started right now, you could get to about 86% of current benefits. And you could wage that. So is Social Security a big problem? It's an easy fix. And then when we look at the data on, let's say, individual retirement accounts and the money coming out of defined benefit and defined contribution plans, because those rollovers, as we now know, are both. And we look at them by age. We don't look at one number, because one number can be so absolutely distorting. If one looks at 1 year's worth of data on the 401k system, for example, and says, what proportion of the individuals in 401k plans this year have less than $10,000 account balance? At year-end 2012, that was 61%. Now, what if instead you look at the last few years, 2007 to 2012 year-end? In our database now, of the total database, about 30 million 401k participants. In that database, about 9 million have been in it for that period. What percentage had less than $10,000 in account balance who've got that period of continuous participation? Not that long. 18% less than $10,000. When we think about and we read about defined benefit plans, why do people say, well, that's so good? Well, it's because they say, for the person at 30 years who gets 2% per year, they get 60% replacement. The article never goes on to say what percentage of the people would ever meet that criteria. So the article is automatically, this is God's gift to the world. And for the 30-year employee like my dad, or frankly, if I had one at 35 years, be pretty darn good. Thank you. I don't have one, but... And when my board made the decision in 1983, having committed upon my hiring that I would have a defined benefit plan, and they voted not to have one, that was the year that I knew that things in America were changing dramatically. Because who led the charge on my board to not do it? the vice chairman of the Equitable Life Assurance of the United States, a lifelong actuary who that year was the head of the Society of Actuaries, because he came to our meeting and he'd just come from an Equitable board meeting at which the Equitable had just voted to eliminate its final pay defined benefit plan and move to a fairly limited cash balance plan. And he said the time has passed when any private or nonprofit enterprise can afford the volatility and the long-term issues related here. I didn't know if it was right or wrong. I knew it meant I wouldn't have a defined benefit plan if I stayed at EBRI. But it also told me that if somebody who, as recently as 6 months before, had been one of the world's strongest advocates of defined benefit plans, Harry Garber, the late, is things were going to change. And you look at this chart vis-a-vis the numbers that get printed of a given account balance and the rollover amounts, and go back to the shortfalls, and you can see why the shortfalls can be small. If we then look at where year-end balances are, don't take a number. Anybody that uses a number is going to distort because we know everyone in this room has their own number. They have their own need. Every employee has their own number, their own need, and beyond. And just from this simple one, and in the issue brief, you'll see a grid that's far more complicated than this with far more breaks. The person that would have had a great defined benefit also has $321,000 as an average account balance in that demographic. Then take what we've started doing in the last 3 years, combine individual retirement accounts by unique identifier. We don't know who the person is, we just know we can match them. And combine those that have defined contribution and IRA balances and go to that bottom line, and that average account balance for that group of people is $735,000. And even down at the 20th percentile of those with 10 to 20 years of eligibility, it's $46,000. The virtue of tenure, the virtue of portability, the virtue of rolling over, the absolute importance of carrying what Larry Zempelman talked about into the realm of finding ways to help all our employees understand, in essence, the necessity of future security that comes with the necessity of rolling over distributions, and trying to convince everybody we work with that the country, the enterprise, has a social responsibility, if nothing else, to care enough about the departing employee to make sure that money gets preserved. And then even shorter tenure people can do this well. And then there's that bottom line issue of, will Social Security and Medicare be there? That backdrop. The dynamic, the nasty dynamic that was talked about yesterday morning. Certainly our opening keynote speaker did not say a lot to build confidence that they know how to get out of this challenge. Then based on the latest news reports, just imagine that Capitol dome with scaffolding around it so you can't even really see it as they work on it the next few years. And the U.S. government has a little problem. He simply verbalized it. This is a picture of it from the Congressional Budget Office. The spending line ideally would be below the revenue line, not that far above it. But again, go to the bottom chart. Look at the Social Security line. Social Security is not the problem or the challenge. It can be fixed. It should be fixed. The Medicare line, the health line, that green line, that is a problem. And the yellow line. And that yellow line is based on an assumption of long-term interest rates going back up a bit, but only a bit. So if we were to re-enter the 1970s, when interest rates the Federal Reserve, the all-powerful, moved them to 14% and 17%, then that yellow line would almost go straight up. So I do not at any level attempt to say there are not big challenges, and brought on by the demography. I've mentioned to this group in prior years, I still keep myself focused by once a month going to the web and doing 3 life expectancy calculators. My brother taught me never to smoke. My dad taught me to not drink much. My mother said, don't be like me and just get your exercise at work. Exercise. And those life expectancy calculators, month after month, come back and say, you're probably going to be here to between 103 and 108. And I go back to work. And I keep saving my 20%. And I buy my longevity insurance. And I say to my wife, are you really sure you want to have lunch and dinner with me that long? She's been putting up with me for 40 years now. And against that backdrop, things around the world are clearly changing. The debates over government programs, be it Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, they're going to be there, as they are around the world. Because the issue of how to pay for the demographics on the prior chart are real. The amount that we and everyone that we know needs to save and accumulate and plan for, it's real. So against my assigned topic, there not today is not a retirement crisis. If there's deemed to be one today, then there's been one for every day of the history of the United States of America. And the nature of that crisis was far greater at almost every data point, at least before, based on the data I showed you, at least before 1998, which was the point at which vesting finally got up to nearly match participation. In other words, payout ratios out of the plans prior to 1998 were still pretty low. Not many people were getting much. There's always been a savings challenge. Why? We're a consumption-oriented economy. What was the emphasis yesterday morning? What was the rationale given by Mohammed for everything that the Fed does, that central banks do? Trying to pull growth from the future to today by convincing people to spend far more than they really probably should be spending today to create the economic growth, to get the engine going. I didn't hear a word about the Fed caring about whether or not people save. And what do we know that their policy has done to defined benefit plans? It's harmed them. What do we know it's done to defined contribution plans? One of the largest employers in the United States that was one about midline when they went to a cash balance retirement plan. Their cash balance retirement plan, big company. The annual interest crediting rate in that cash balance plan, still to this day, is 1-year treasuries plus 1%. Most of you in this room know from the charts yesterday, 1-year treasuries haven't paid much for the last few years. So in that cash balance retirement plan, the crediting rate has been less than 1.3% for 6 years running. Yet individuals hear, the media, well, a cash balance plan is definitionally better than a 401k plan. We had presentations yesterday about stable value And the issue of stable value and the challenge that Tom Woodruff and I were facing is because they've been paying 3%. And the reaction was, that's a lousy return, but 3% relative to 1 plus a little bit in a cash balance plan? They're almost robbing the bank, Tom. World experience is that a universal mandatory system, call it Social Security or call it what Larry Fink advocated of mandating all, or what the President's Carter Commission recommended, but they didn't recommend universal mandatory. The President's Commission recommendation, had it been implemented, would have moved participation in the labor force to roughly 61%, from roughly 49%. The so-called universal IRA that's been talked about, the default IRA, the automatic IRA, under the most optimistic estimates, would move coverage up to about 63%. Versus Social Security, which is at 97%. Why? Because the only way that universal truth is there is if you are collecting money on every single dollar somebody earns, no matter how little they work or how infrequently they work, and then you're pooling it all, and you're pooling all that longevity risk and all that mortality risk. And then you got to make sure you don't promise too much. And one of the reasons our Social Security system, relative to others around the country, is in pretty good shape, because there's only one country in the world that has a more meager Social Security benefit than the United States, and that's the United Kingdom. And we're just a little bit above that. And the countries that have the welfare state problem, their Social Security benefit as average replacement rates are over 3 times those of the United States. That's called expensive. So we've actually managed it pretty well. World experience is also that annuity-based programs are the most effective at making money go the furthest. Why? Because it reduces cost for a population by about 1/3. How much needs to be saved is reduced by 1/3 if a given group says, we'll go together and we'll cover each other in a risk pool. Insurance and annuities were not invented by accident. They're economically efficient. If I'm still alive at 86, the reason that that insurance company will be able to pay me until 108 is because of all the people that bought it that didn't live until 85. It's the nature of insurance. Libertarians hate it, but it works. And as DB plans increasingly have moved to lump sums for over 40 years, another item I'd put on your timeline was 1980s, Chief Actuary, Internal Revenue Service, Ira Cohen, signs a letter that says any enterprise that provides anyone with any lump sum must provide it to everyone in a defined benefit plan. I happened to be at the Conference of Actuaries in Public Practice where he announced that. And he was asked, well, what do you think the result of that will be? And he said, no defined benefit plan will provide any lump sum distributions. A week later, the company that was the reason for that ruling went back into its board meeting. What it had adopted and proposed to the IRS was that anybody with an annuity value of $35,000 a year or less, it would all be annuity, and above $35,000 a year, you could take lump sum. The board immediately voted to eliminate the $35,000 and to make lump sums available to every employee. It was an oil company, and every other oil company had followed suit within 3 years. And so the unintended consequences of an action, in fact, exactly the opposite of the consequence contemplated by Ira Cohen, changed the system as it exists. And what we've done in the financial literacy programs that Larry talked about with our Choose to Save website, our ballpark estimate worksheet, the Save for Your Future, the videos, it is about education from the youngest ages to the oldest ages. And if, when given choices in education, only 27% of those given an annuity option take it, it says for the other 70 plus that they are going to need that financial literacy and that education to carry them for decades. And if we don't start providing it to our kids every day and young, we won't get there. So I'll end where Muhammad mentioned and ended yesterday. We are in a world where every one of us goes to work every day and works on something where we can make a real difference, and we do. And whether it's one by one and the joy of seeing in the eyes of that 22-year-old that they just figured out they're leaving money on the table and they actually should participate in that retirement plan even though they know they'll never get old. Or the joy I felt with my brother-in-law and sister-in-law when I convinced them to be the outlier and to take a 100% JNS option that would provide 3% per year life indexation beginning in year 7, rather than the slightly higher benefit of a straight annuity. We all can think of those moments where we've touched, where we've made a difference, and we can do so much more of that, and you do it each and every day. Thanks for your time and your attention.